I just realized that I was writing a blog and I've been promoting it for so long, mythictruth.com, only to realize that somebody took it down, which is weird because I have it for a yearly membership. But anyway, whatever. It's just my personal story as to the reasons and the many reasons that I'm taking a postmodern approach to life and kind of not wanting to really debunk religion as a phenomenon in the world, as much as I want to help us all understand why having organized groups in the world is basically just a way for civilizations to kind of group themselves and understand, hopefully, non stereotypically, how to kind of relate to each other, just kind of broadly. So, I mentioned yesterday in one of my videos that a lot of tradition has been called tradition because it was around the time of Jesus. So 2,000 years ago is basically what we call the beginning of tradition. I read this on a post, someone actually enlightened me with that on Facebook. And it's just a way of saying that from the point of Jesus' birth all the way forward is basically what we've been trying to build civilization on. And from that point onwards, we've had Islam come into the picture around 500 years after that. And when I say Islam, it's really hard to understand it not as a construct or as a religion. Like if I say, there's a verse in the Quran that talks about Ibrahim, who majority of people believe as someone who is almost like the father of all prophets. And he says, God says about him that he was not a Jewish, he was not a Christian. What he was just somebody who was inclining to truth. So it's basically what I'm talking about. He's just somebody who was on the spiritual path and he wanted to understand a way of figuring out the way the universe works and what resonates with him on some kind of personal and deep level. So it wasn't until after that we almost became more evolved into trying to figure out what is civilization and how do we build and advance so that we can all get together as a collective and nobody has to feel like they're overriding anybody or superseding anybody in any way other than in just what naturally happens when people study really well, understand something in a very kind of constructive way. They're able to kind of contribute that into the world and God helps them. That's in Arabic, that's called tawfiq, which means it's just God-given success. So someone can call that good karma, right? So there's different religions that'll talk about how this kind of evolves and how it allows itself to manifest in the world. But being right now in a postmodern world, 2023, I have a very hard time saying that Islam is a way that doesn't involve everybody already, right? We all submit to the fact that our heart is beating. I can't take away the fact that and say, no, my heart is doing one thing and my brain's doing another thing, and that's it. You can say, okay, that's a way for you to understand reality. It doesn't take away from actual reality, which is that your heart is beating, your mind is beating, and scientifically we know that outside of what the metaphysical is, like faith and how your understanding of God and religion and whatever it is that's going to make up you as an individual human, is what is going to help your consciousness propel itself forward in some kind of productive way. So if you want to talk about a legacy, you want to talk about, okay, part of my consciousness and from like the collective consciousness of like all humanity may come up with an idea, but mine won't last because I refuse to be somebody who submits to my heart, which means my heart is trying to say, I miss this meaning making, like I miss looking at the universe. So it's almost like you're denying your existence in a way, like something very fundamental about your existence. Now, some people say, well, why don't you go and tell people that they're doing it wrong? That's not my job. My job is to do what I'm doing right now. Is that, I have an idea, I want to share it. Some people will say, but you know what? This is something that everybody needs to understand. That's okay. I put the blog out there, somebody took it down. If people have censor, that's not my problem. That's society, and that's something all of us as a collective have to figure out what do we want to deal with. I remember when I was in Egypt might have been 1993, so a very long time ago. I might have been 8. I was visiting my dad's village, and my cousins we were all watching TV. And at the time, it was the president, Mubarak. He went down with the Arab Spring in 2010. But anyway, the wife, like, so it was my uncle's family, but his wife, she was, we, I don't know, some kind of like pause in programming, and then he had this kind of video recording of him, and she said to me, she goes, "There's your president." And at the time, I was like, "What on earth?" So I just took it like very personal. I'm like, so I'm supposed to relate to him in some personal way as like he's mine. And it wasn't until later that they're like, "No, no, no, this is like the country, Egypt," and he was the president at the time, who was kind of like trying to understand how to rule the country or run the country. Now, they talk about it as being a republic or a democracy. I don't know, because back then, any kind of public displays of affection on television, or any kind of, I should reword that, any kind of television program that promoted any kind of public display of affection or showed affection in any way was censored. So we couldn't watch any of that. And it was almost seen as like, to me, if I look back now, it just looks like a transition, because this was like, gosh, 20 years ago. So it was almost to say, we're kind of waking up to Hollywood and cinema and all of this. We love watching cinema, and we're learning language in Egypt. We've got English and French, and alongside Arabic, and we're trying to understand, like, how is it that we want to integrate all these new ways of seeing in the world. So we're starting slow, kind of like the way my parents, when they came here to Canada from Egypt, they didn't really know much about the culture, and they loved their own culture, even though now they realize that it was just basically the Arabic barrier that was kind of there. Outside of that, just different ways of understanding the universe. So some will say here it was predominantly Christian, there it was predominantly Egyptian. Egyptian, because yeah, Egyptian, when you say that, it actually involves Coptic Christian and Muslim. And at the time of the Prophet of Muhammad, um, Egypt was known as a place that was not really monotheist in a certain way. And we know that it goes all the way back to ancient Egyptians. So the people from Muhammad's time in Arabia, they did come to Egypt, and they did try to help it. I don't know, like the population kind of understand that, you know, this is what we believe, and if we can't get along, then we have to find a way to coexist. And you'll find that after Muhammad's time, the ideas that he came with did spread. And then when they met up with Christianity, that's where they started to integrate and kind of build on new rules of understanding how to build law and civilization. And then celibacy became a thing. So I don't really know how to evolve out of that again, and just wonder about, like, what is it about cultures and societies that transition out of something that's kind of conservative in some way, and they almost have to almost like shut down everything and then start over again in some kind of almost piecemeal way, like to say, okay, well, we know celibacy doesn't work right now, so let's see what comes next. It could be, well, you can't have a relationship outside of marriage, so you have to wait until then. Maybe that's the way some societies want to work, but my struggle is, if I was running a country like Canada, for example, and I was saying, we already are a very democratic country, we love freedom of expression, everybody here is used to following different ways of seeing and living. We're glad that we can understand a little bit more about the idea of just submitting to your existence and the natural way, which is Taoism, which is like an effortless way of existing, that is almost the result of wanting to align yourself with the universe. So if you are trying to live an ethical way, the result of that is that you are just very given a lot of facilitation in life that's just easy. Your life just becomes very easy because you're not going against what your natural life is, your natural instinct is. So to go to celibacy and then think, it's actually not working, is a good way of evolving, because then you realize, no, I still have these affections in my heart when I see like somebody who's attractive. So that tells me that celibacy, which is to say I don't want to get involved with anybody in any kind of sexual or intimate way, is not probably going to be a good idea for me, because I'm going against what my natural body wants. So this might cause problems, cause health problems for me, mental health problems for me. Somebody else might be attracted to me and then decide, like, why can't I get to know you? And you can say, well, because this is a personal choice, or depending on your family, you might say, well, this is what I have to practice because my family believes this. Now, it's not fair to that person now, because it's like, well, I want to get to know you. Do you believe this? And you might say, no, but my parents forced me. this is where God clearly says there's no compulsion in religion. You're not allowed to do that as parents. And that's basically what the Prophet came up against, like Muhammad came up against, and why he had to leave. It's what Ibrahim had to come up against and why he had to leave. Yunus, Jonas, same thing. He came up against all these people who keep saying, no, you have to do what we do, because it makes us, sometimes it gives them kind of like a nostalgia to what their parents used to do or their ancestors used to do. But still, God says in the Quran, he says, that's not an excuse. What your ancestors used to do was fine for their time. A few years later, it's not going to work anymore. And you have to concede with the next generation and say, okay, yeah, we have to allow you to move on. So we know that at the end of time, Muhammad says that everybody's going to be on a path except for one group of people. So we know that within Islam, there's already a group of people who call themselves Sunni Muslim, which means we're trying to practice the way the Prophet practiced exactly. We know that that's nearly impossible. Like, you can take the spirit of it, but you can't say that 1400 years ago we're going to be doing the exact same thing that the Prophet did, right? So that's why he kind of warned. He said, don't make me like Jesus. Don't worship me. It's good that you love to do what I do, but I'm setting an example for how you can think. So think in a broader, like, kind of metaphorical, abstract way, that I'm here to challenge the status quo from the time of ignorance, which was basically his own tribe. And that's the idea, is that you're allowed to basically engage in every kind of way of life, from very impoverished, like an orphan, to a king, because he spent time with, or like he sent delegations back and forth with the different civilizations that were around him, so the Romans and the Persians at the time. And the idea is that because we understand, this is, like I talked about this, I think, in the Postmodern Islam playlist, what the Zeitgeist is. So at the time in Arabia, for example, it might have been that men are tribal, women are maybe used as concubines, which means they're kind of like a form of entertainment for men. And then men travel back and forth. They have these idols, like maybe at the time of what Ibrahim was kind of contending with, is that these gods remind us of certain things to pray for. But it wasn't about this reminding us about a larger God. It was that this idol here is a God, and God, there's some kind of sustainer also outside the world. And then we talked about yesterday why that's a problem, because it creates confusion in the way clarity of thought regarding the universe can kind of align itself inside of us, right? So if you think there's so many gods and then there's one God, it would be like, well, why does God need all those? So it's like, oh, so we just have a problem with language maybe, and how we understand language in the world. So as we're evolving, we're getting to understand what this is. So because we know that Muhammad came up against this and he said, I'm showing you that this was what was practiced, and it's almost like God inspired me to leave. I couldn't stay in Mecca, where the Kaaba is, where they had, like, if you look right now in Arabia, where people go for pilgrimage, that big black cube that's constructed, some say it was there from the beginning of time, from when Adam was on earth, and then some say that Ibrahim, it kind of eroded during the flood, and then Ibrahim and his son had to rebuild it. And during Muhammad's time, it was filled with idols. It's almost to say, like, God knew this was going to happen, so he told Muhammad not to stay there, so that when he comes up to an age of maybe understanding that I want to pray, I'm not going to be praying to something, and inside of it, it looks like it has idols, which is not in keeping with what his inclination was to begin with. So when he did actually go back, I think almost 22 years after his first revelation from Angel Gabriel, he ended up not even wanting to stay in Mecca. He stayed in Medina, the city where he built his first mosque or place of worship. Almost to say that, you know what, we have this nostalgia, we have these attachments to our hometown, as it were. My family might be Egypt, right? My family's friends, a lot of them are Egyptian still. And they have this sort of affinity, like, this is our home and we love our history. And that's fine. Our history is not that great. In spite of having the ancient ruins, it's something to kind of be like, awestruck by, just because of, like, when you go to the pyramids and, they look really tiny in the pictures, but then you go there in person, you're like, oh, they're actually pretty big. Cool. And then that's it, right? And then you can go down south. It's actually called Upper Egypt, but then you find Luxor, which is a lot of other really cool ruins and different ways of understanding the science of Egypt, to call it, like the study of how the ancient world used to understand the universe. And some of it you might find aligns with the way we think now. Some of it maybe is gone. And that's good. It's just a way of saying that nothing is permanent. It's almost like God, he says, like, go look and go travel and see what happens around the world and how people who thought they could live forever don't live forever, right? They dig up these tombs and they find that people who were buried with gold, as though like they're starting to believe that there's a next life and that we have rebirth, but you don't actually have your life coming back to you in a way that says, look, you woke up with the same body and you get to have everything that you had with you back in your previous life. You're not going to want that because it won't even make sense. So they just forgot to factor in that time changes and civilizations change. And thank goodness, because I mean, especially in the desert, now they have in Egypt, they have air conditioned buildings and they have resorts so people can go from any part of the country and feel like the lifestyle isn't really different from what they're used to, which kind of creates a culture shock that can be uncomfortable. So all of these things that we've adapted with as humans is a wonderful thing to celebrate. And I don't understand why. I mean, I do understand why sometimes cultures find a hard time kind of moving that way, and they want to keep the past, and they also like we want to be the present, but we miss the past. And that's where God says that's why there are levels of reward in the world and karma. So the people who are able to overcome that tradition and say, I like it and I have something to learn from it, but God doesn't get stuck in time. So I can take that idea and I can move ahead with it and up. And that's what creates all these people who can create so much technology and make use of it in an ethical way. And they're very successful. So for me to say no, because I believe in God, I should take away your success and call you like very unkind names about, not believing in God or anything like that. God says you have no right to do that because you don't know what's in their hearts. They're my creation. Like God's saying, this is my creation. All these hearts are beating for me because I'm the one that gave them life. You don't have any right to take away their life. You have no right to take away their feelings of security and spiritual life. So doing that actually creates more problems. It creates wars and it creates this feeling of we have to have a standard of the best way to live. But if you think about it, governments who are democratic, they already have that standard. They're working on it. They're constantly improving on it because you have to elect people and you have to understand, well, a lot of the people who elected this person don't know what his spiritual life is. And some think that's a problem. Some don't think it's a problem. They're just like, well, we're just trying our best. And we're so grateful that God's here to help us, that he'll inspire us and he has angels to inspire us. And we'll just do our best. So for example, right now, if I'm thinking about, I want to homeschool because let's say I have 7 kids. And I'm thinking the oldest one might right now be 17, which means, they might be going to university. And you think, I don't know, they probably have a certain standard that universities look at, like how were your grades in high school so that we know that you won't have a problem in university. It won't be something that's too difficult for you, for example. Right? So now maybe he thinks, oh, maybe I should spend a year or 2 in high school, in an actual high school. And then when I go to university, I'll kind of have an understanding of what the structure is. That might be a choice. Or maybe the government has these certain tests that says you can go to high school during exam time and write these exams. And then we'll give you a grade that'll kind of help us understand like how to kind of fit you into a university culture, for example, because grades are just the way that as you get older, they help people understand like how much you understand about a subject. So let's pretend you're in an art class and you've been getting some understanding of theory. So sometimes they'll show you this is what different kinds of art is. If you paint with this style, it's one thing. If you paint with this style, I never used to understand any of this. And when I was in high school, I only took art, I think in grade 9 or 10. And that was just the only class. So I got an introduction to what all this is and what it all involves. And so for me to say, yes, I'm an artist would be okay, that's cool. But it's not the same as somebody who studied it in a deep way and can tell you, like I can curate a museum, which means I can kind of put things in a certain order so that people who come and visit can sort of have an appreciation for why we study art. So if I go in to university, for example, and I say, I expect that I'll get 100%, even though I haven't studied, means you are trying to explain that you understand 100% of what a museum curator can do, right? Some people can say maybe it's a natural talent and a skill, and maybe that's something that you can just come to naturally. Some people say, I mean, if you studied, that would probably support you a lot because then you have a lot of that background theory that we talked about that sometimes happens when you study or you buy a software program that helps you understand what previous people used to do. maybe that'll support you and it'll give you like a brand new appreciation for the whole study of, museum. uh I guess it's a way of like why we have museums and why we like to preserve things in time, and why sometimes we have it seasonal. So, we think that society is really interested right now about like science and technology. So they'll have, different ways of showing the whole pioneering process of it. Maybe it started with the computer or calculator, who knows? So when I was at Carleton, we went to a museum that talked about God, and it was pretty neat because it showed the different dimensions that sometimes exist within the idea of what is the universe. And then you'll go into these different rooms and they'll talk about different things. And one of the things that people are within the Sunni tradition are not familiar with is Sufism. And Sufism is a very mystical way of understanding the universe, which means it goes really, really deep inside your psyche or your mind or your heart, and it helps you kind of align with like what is music, and what is it when people are trying to align with God in a way that as they progress, they find a way of almost it's almost like attracting this peace or attracting these angels that just want to be in your presence because you're just in constant remembrance. It's very different than a scholar who's in tradition, maybe Sunni, maybe Shia, maybe Ismaili, like any kind of, maybe even Christian, like Jewish. There's a whole scholarship of um, study, I want to say, around how to read scripture and how to apply it in the world, right? So this is what I mean when I call scholars, is that they have an appreciation for the music, but what their concern is, how do we understand what these doctrines were from the past relative to a civilization? So how do we apply them? And some people want to keep them in a niche outside of society that's just like a democratic society, because they feel like you're not really helping us understand if you want your religion to be a business, or if we're allowed to have it as a business, or how we're supposed to understand the world without you. So it's almost like we appreciate what you've done in the world and how you've helped us understand, Muhammad and Jesus and Moses, for example, and maybe Ibrahim and David. And on top of that, you're making it seem like it's very difficult for us to exist in the world without you telling us what to do. So that almost brings us back to what was happening in Europe, like before the Renaissance or before the Enlightenment, where people used to feel like because we speak Latin, we're the only ones that can read the Bible and tell you what to believe. But then you have to understand what bias is. Like, remember when I told you the story about you have something in your heart that you want to do that's a desire, but you know that you can't because you have heart surgery, so you can't do it. You're biased to wanting to go on this ride. That's your subjective idea of like, I really, really want to do this because it's close to what my interest is, right? Somebody else who, like, for example, I don't have that surgery, I still have that same bias and that same interests. I can go on it. There's no problem, right? Now, let's pretend there's a third person there who says, well, because this one person has a heart surgery, it's now, we're going to have to close the park. No one's allowed to go on the rides. You think, is that even fair? Like, the park has rides for people who can't take that kind of happy stress on their heart. They can go on other rides. Why are we going to shut down the park just for one person? And that's why we created like this whole process of understanding, okay, we do have to be careful when we study scripture. People maybe should understand a little bit of the language. So back then it was Latin. So people started to understand, oh, not a lot of us know how to read. So they started to learn how to read. They started to learn how to write. The printing press became a thing where people started to figure out what paper is and how to photocopy and create books so that they can spread all these different ideas. Now, if we think about it, okay, well, let's compare that to Muhammad's time. He spoke Arabic. We have the Quran. Like, I have it, the actual Arabic scripture of it. But now you find like all over the internet, everywhere in the world, it's translated in almost every language with lots of commentary to explain why it was revealed, like why these certain verses came down with Angel Gabriel. And then you can say, okay, so basically everybody's allowed to read it and draw conclusions about how to live. I mean, yes and no, because like I said, it's all metaphor. It's not literal, even though when you read it, it might sound literal. Like, for example, I'll give you one of the chapters, that's, I think it's chapter 9. in it, it sounds like it's just full of violence. Like it says, if you see somebody who's a polytheist or somebody who worships more than one god, just kill them, right? Now, you have to go back 1400 years, first of all, and then understand the prophet's life. So that verse or that chapter was probably revealed near the end of his life, after he came back from Medina, the city, to Mecca, where the Kaaba was. And when he went, the first time, he said he wanted to just go and kind of just remember, like, I just want to visit because I miss this place. And they said, no, you can't. And he had to go back. So he's like, okay. He felt kind of sad about it, but he's like, I can worship God anywhere. And then he went back a second year. And when he ended up going, they said, okay, we shouldn't probably keep you away. And when he went, he actually went inside the Kaaba and he destroyed all the idols, because they were starting to believe that, actually, you know what, we don't really have a right to kind of do what we're doing. And after that, he still didn't stay there. He just had his kind of time to worship, and then he went back to his city. And even though people were starting to agree that, yeah, there's only one God, we shouldn't build these idols because sometimes it misleads people, there are still some people who are kind of on the fence, meaning they're not really sure what to believe. And sometimes maybe they're thinking about their businesses, like, we used to make money off of those idols, right? Like, people used to come visit to pay to worship those idols, and we don't have that business anymore. So they're almost like, we really want that. So you can say that they don't really understand the spirit of what Muhammad was trying to do, which is to help them align with the universe in a healthier way. So God left them. He's just like, you can do whatever you want, but if you're standing in the way of somebody who's trying not to do that, and you're still forcing them to buy your business, then that's where God says you can fight them, because now they're hurting your heart, right? Like, if I'm deciding, no, I just want to worship God in a way that I don't have to see him. I just know that if I'm standing here and making a prayer, God can already hear me. Like, I can feel my pulse, and inspiration can be in any form of anything, because there's like the animal kingdom, there's humans, there's wind, there's trees. Anything can give me a sign that I could say, okay, I'm going to build on that idea, and I'm going to think about it and see what kind of creative imagination I come with. Now, if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I just built this idol, come, you can worship it. And you know what? If you pray to it for like 10 minutes, I'll charge you only $50, and it's going to make your dreams come true. You can say, no, thank you. I was like, no, 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 really, come with me. And you're like, no, I don't want to. And then maybe there'll be a bully, and they're like, if you don't, I'm going to spread these lies about you. Now, think about what this person's doing. This is where God says you're allowed to actually hurt them. Like, say, I am going to actually fight you if you don't stop, because you're taking away from my freedom of expression and my free will. Like, you're forcing me to do something I don't want to do. So if you understand that chapter now that I go back to, where God says, if you find them, you can kill them, it's almost because you already had 23 years to understand why Muhammad came, why we're trying to fight people like you who don't want to listen. And it's almost like we're fed up. Like, you're allowed to defend yourself with violence if it comes to that, because it's now self-defense. Like, you're trying to remain a safe person with God, which is a bigger purpose than trying to obey somebody. Like, I'm sorry, you're still a human, and there's still something bigger than you that I'm trying to align with. And you're not respecting my right. I'm trying to respect your right and say, you can do whatever you want. Hopefully the universe will align with you in a certain way, and you'll stop whatever it is you're doing and maybe find a different business. But for now, please leave me alone. And that's all. So for somebody to come in and say, I'm somebody who lives in Canada, and I see that everybody around me looks like they don't worship God the way I worship God, I can't just set a bomb and kill everybody. It's just like, how do you can't, what just happened? And that's where you go back to the spiritual path and what I was talking about yesterday, where it's very difficult to teach what I'm teaching and assume that I understand that what I'm doing is right, or for people to think what I'm doing is right or judge me, or for me to judge other people and assume that what they're doing is wrong. Because their heart's beating, their heart is already thinking in their mind, like, how do we connect it with the universe? And everybody around us is thinking in a spiritual way to begin with, because look, our tradition was from 2,000 years ago with Jesus. So everybody believes that in some way, even if they don't think it with words, because they don't have the words yet, they're believing it. So leave them alone. And this is my struggle right now, because sometimes when people hear my messages, because I'm relying a lot on the Quran or on Jesus or on these stories, they want to take my voice and buy it, almost like what I say what artists do in Hollywood, and say, we want you to represent us. And I'll say, okay, I don't mind, but tell me a bit about what you believe, so that I make sure that we're aligning and that we're not miscommunicating something. So maybe they say, no, never mind. And then they take my voice anyway. So they take my picture and everything that I do and they put it with a group. Let's call this group Wahhabi. I don't know what that is. Right? So now maybe this group is actually people who believe that anybody who doesn't actually call themselves Muslim, they should kill. I don't believe that. I don't even call myself Muslim anymore for that reason, because I'm like, the way you're thinking is not at all what the Prophet would have allowed. So now I go and I see, okay, the myth of truth, and I'm trying to find my blog that talks about why my ideas have changed and why my views have changed, and it's not there anymore. I'm like, what? I just put that on the internet. Like, where did it go? And then I think back to Egypt and I think, oh, it's censored. So people are still kind of like getting used to the idea of like, are we allowed to think this way? It's like, what do you mean are we? I'm thinking this way and I'm allowing other people to think this way. A lot of people already think this way. If you as a group don't want to think that way, leave my voice alone. Like, give me back my name, give me back my voice, and you guys do whatever you want. You don't need me. I don't need you. We all are looking for something bigger than us in the universe. So this is what it is. In the end of the, like, we all know that there's going to be a time where there's going to be a correct way of understanding the universe. I think it is postmodernism within a democratic world, which means we're living in a country where there are civic rules of how to understand how to live with each other, which basically is kindness. You know, we have to follow certain laws which help us all stay safe. Outside of that, your spiritual path is your own. And that is almost, how do you understand how to align in a spiritual way outside of living and working with people in public? And I guess that's for everyone to decide.